One. All right. Hello and thank you. Today we've got another interview with an academic who speaks about anime. We have Dr. Brent Allison, an associate professor at the University of North Georgia, with us. And Dr. Allison has talked a bit about teaching an anime and how those two intersect. And he's gone about speaking at conventions such as Anime Expo and MomoCon, and just recently got back from a trip to the Orient, if I'm correct.
Yeah, there was a fellowship, the Chinese Studies Institute, that's actually affiliated, it's a joint venture between the American Association of Colleges and Universities and a subsidiary of the Ministry of Education in China. And the idea was to have 15 professors who had absolutely no knowledge in Chinese language or history or culture or anything like that, and to sort of get us up to speed in a very whirlwindy kind of tour. We had gone to Shanghai, Xi'an, and Beijing. We met with, gosh, it seemed like at least a dozen different universities to talk about potential academic exchanges and the like. And so it was really enjoyable. It was the first time I've ever been in China. And then since Anime Expo was going to be over in in Los Angeles like a week after that was over, I thought to myself, well, may as well just go ahead and camp out in Japan and just visit a few friends there. So I went to Tokyo, went to Osaka, and just caught up with a bunch of people who I've known over the years, and then went straight to Anime Expo. And yeah, I got home like less than a week ago, and let's just say I've gotten a pretty good appreciation for Georgia. If no other reason, I don't have to go around crazy and whatnot. So yeah.
Right, right. It's definitely a whirlwind, I'm sure. Um, but it's adventurous too, and you're getting out there, and you get to share your ideas with people. I think that's really cool. Um,
Yeah, it was actually what one of the more interesting parts was Shanghai. When I apparently in Shanghai, there were several universities, and we each of us had to make an individual presentation,
uh-huh.
depending on what institution that we were visiting. And for Shanghai, it was, I believe, their Department of Media, Production, and even there were like some animation people who were sort of studying there to kind of bring themselves up to speed with some of my work. And when I was talking about Chinese animation and potentialities for studying that, they sort of looked at me across the table and they were like, "So, what do you think might be wrong with Chinese animation?" And
Ooh.
yeah, I'm definitely no expert in Chinese animation at all. And I was just sort of like, "Okay, how do I criticize your art form I know nothing about?"
Wait, did they take it poorly that you brought up Chinese animation? From what I understand, your exchange wasn't particularly about animation or your work with Japanese visual anime and things like that. So you kind of broached that, and did they? What was the reaction by them when you started talking about animation?
Oh no, they had fully expected that I was going to be talking about Japanese animation and how that might compare to what I might do with Chinese animation.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so they fully expected that, that's what I was going to be talking about. And so I think it wasn't so much that I didn't really sense not as much like hostility from them, more as just like earnest. We really want to know what people might be thinking about our burgeoning industry. From what I can tell,
Oh,
um,
cool.
Chinese animation really hasn't, been put out there until about 2014 or so. That's when you started to first see first see a lot of releases. And when I was trying to think how to respond to that, I basically took a common criticism with the Japanese animation, applied to Chinese animation. From what I saw, was that a lot of the stories seemed to be kind of predictable. And they actually sort of took that. They sort of nodded and they basically, I'd say, wanted me to clarify. So basically what you're saying is our story should be a little bit more unexpected. I'm like, yeah. And I emphasize that this is something that could apply to practically any other medium, anime included, live action, and whatever else. So, but that's one of the biggest struggles I think anybody who's writing any kind of script has is, how do we keep the audience guessing? How do we throw them something that they necessarily haven't seen before? So, but yeah, I'm kind of excited to see what Chinese animation studios might be putting out in the next few years. It's very much an industry I think in flux, and we'll see what happens.
Right, right. We were just doing our end of the season discussion on Saturday, and we brought up the King's Avatar that aired this past season,
Yes,
an
yes.
esports show in Chinese animation, and yeah, that kind of was the first glimpse of, well, Chinese anime is here and real and tangible in a way that we're gonna have to pay attention to.
Especially if you
Mm.
factor in like the success of The Mermaid from I think last year, Stephen Chow's animated film or partially animated film, or the inclusion of CGI. I think there's definitely a lot to see.
Yeah, I also liked 10,000 Bad Jokes. If you haven't seen that movie, that's actually pretty funny.
Mm. Um, so that's awesome and really cool. We could probably spend the entire hour talking about, your visit to China and then Japan and then Anime Expo too. But I do want to start at the beginning, so to say. I want to get the origin of why you came to be where you are today. And it seems like you've got two equal parts, the part about anime and then the part about the pedagogy, getting the ideas across and using it in for teaching. So which came first? Was it that you knew you were going to be a teacher of some sort and then found out that anime was how you wanted to devote yourself to that or apply that? Or were you always an anime fan that kind of ended up in academia?
More of a teacher, first off. I didn't get into anime really seriously until I was about 24 years old.
Oh, wow.
And when I started my PhD program, I thought that I was going to be studying computer hackers and how is it that they had operated as sort of educational collective in their own right. So, I would be hanging out with 2600. I'd be going to DEF CON, the convention for hackers in Las Vegas. And when I entered my PhD program, I was like, all right, we're going to go ahead and study hackers. We're going to see how they learn. We're going to see how they teach. What is it that teachers could learn from hackers and the like. And while I was hanging out with the hackers, one of them, this was like back in 1999, they showed this Japanese animation stuff at one of their smaller conventions, and it would put there's something called Armitage 3 that they had on there, and I was just like, okay, this is sort of intriguing, but I didn't really think anything about it. And then another convention I went to, they had this Gunsmith Cats kind of animation that was going on, and then they were like, yeah, they have the stereotype of Americans. All they eat is steak and Chinese food or something or other. Since of course, the show takes place in America, and I kind of watched it. I was just like, okay, this is pretty interesting. But it didn't really occur to me that hey, this is something to study. I thought it was just sort of ancillary to what the hackers were doing. So eventually, I started my PhD program, and I kind of find that even though I'm so interested in the hackers, they're not around a lot. Like I'll see them at conventions sometimes, and of course I saw them online a lot. But it was never like I was with them constantly, right? And so, but I still that interest was still kind of there. So my first week that I'm at the University of Georgia, where I was doing my PhD, I walked by this table, and there's this group of people there, and they have this giant television from like the early '80s, and it's showing that stuff that looks a lot like what they were showing at the hacker conventions. This sort of anime stuff. And then I ask, okay, hey, how's it going? You guys into hacking? And they're like, no, not really. But we're definitely in anime. And it's like, oh, okay. Well, we just shake hands, and they're like, oh, we also have these meetings too. And I'm like, it could be fun. Of course, it's my first week in town. I don't know anybody. And
Yeah.
so I'm like, okay, I'll look for any social opportunity or whatever. So I keep going to their meetings, and slowly but surely, I start getting interested in this anime stuff. But I'm thinking to myself, you can't, this isn't researchable. You can't study this stuff. And, who actually does that? And so eventually, with the hackers, it was more like I felt as though when I was talking about the topic with with potential dissertation chairs and professors in the department. They were just sort of like, "Are you getting much data out of this?" And I'm like, "I
Yeah.
don't get a lot of chance to hang around them as much as I used to." And eventually, I'm just sort of like torn. What in the world am I going to do for my dissertation? And there was this other graduate student. She's an academic now, Joycelyn Wilson. She actually studies hip hop in education. And, I was kind of telling her my dilemma. This was like in the middle of my second year while I was over there. And she said, "Well, Brant, you love this anime stuff so much. Why don't you go and write your dissertation on that?" And like, I didn't have a good response to that. I'm like, why don't I do that?
Yeah.
Yeah, and eventually I just realized that a lot of the questions I'm asking about informal teaching and learning that could apply to the hackers could actually apply to the anime fans. And so eventually I just, it was like a few months later, I'm presenting at like Anime Expo. Well, I'm also like doing, yeah, it's weird. It's like I'm also like going to oh gosh, what was it? Animazement. That's it. It was in 2002. That's actually where I
Mhm.
met Mikhail Kulikov, who he and I like. He's the main guy who goes and manages the Anime Expo symposium, Anime and Manga Study Symposium. So we've been like fast friends ever since. But yeah, it just like one thing sort of led to another, and I don't know. This is just sort of a topic that grabbed me by the throat and hasn't let me go ever since.
Crazy. So you attribute most of your interest to anime to that club you encountered?
Yeah, initially it was the club, but I started not only went to other cons, but I went to
Oh,
other clubs as well too
so
that were sort of in the area. And I mean, it's one of my favorite things to do is sort of visit clubs when I can, and not just cons.
sure.
So the thing about that is what I've noticed is the number of campus clubs has sort of declined, ironically, as anime has gotten more popular.
Oh yeah.
Not only that, but existing campus clubs, they've sort of declined in sort of numbers. But I think what's really happening is that a lot of clubs, we actually have more anime clubs now. We just don't call them that. It's 3 or 4 people who are gathering at somebody's apartment or dorm, and they just happen to be watching Crunchyroll together
Yeah.
because you don't have to have any sort of like large organized kind of university club or even a community club. It can be just as simple as just having your friends over, but they don't like advertise themselves like a traditional club does.
Sure. And there's an element of distribution there too. I mean, I assume you were, if that was the late '80s or early '90s, you were watching on, VHS tapes.
Oh yeah, it's like, well, it's sort of like I didn't get into really any kind of fandom until 2000,
Oh,
but when
okay,
I've
but
looked at
still.
say, oh yeah, like Fred Patton's um his kind of biography or autobiography, and when I've looked at like other people who were in fandom way back in the day, like they'll still do panels today.
Yeah,
People who were
yeah.
in fandom, like the late 80s and the 90s, they'll do kind of sometimes they'll call it the old timers panel, or sometimes they'll call it anime of the 80s or something other like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And there are people who are way, way more, have been in this longer than I had, and they're just that I'm still in awe. Actually,
Yeah, right.
I've been to their panels a lot, and every time I go, it's just a blast. It's like I keep finding out things about what happened in early fandom history. I just still don't know. It's like I'm discovering something every year.
Yeah, yeah. And so going back to the anime, what were some of the shows that kind of made it clear to you that this was a medium that was capable of conveying things or really drew you in, especially in that time period of the early 2000s?
Hmm. What really sticks out in my mind is probably Revolutionary Girl Utena. In fact, I had started this kind of seminar of sorts when I was really getting into anime. If you saw Utena, there's, spoiler alert, there's a kind of gathering called the Mikage Seminar that's sort of in the middle of the series. And so I kind of took a cue from that, and I started calling what I was doing the Mikage Seminar, where I would be taking notes about what we were showing at club, and then I would have like 4 or 5 people sort of meet outside of club, and then we were talking about let's go a little bit more deeper into sociological aspects, political aspects, cultural aspects, sometimes economic aspects,
Mm.
or even scientific aspects of whatever it was that we happened to be watching at the time. So, and that lasted about a couple of years or so, and that's actually how I met my wife. She started going to the Mikage seminar because hey, we also talked about Utana, and so she
Uh,
really liked, and we just sort of hit it off, and oh gosh, we've been together for like 15 years now. So,
Oh, you're a lucky man.
yeah.
Wow. Um, yeah, we just rewatched the Utna movie actually 2 weekends
Ooh.
ago, and yeah, that it's so. I guess if you talk to enough people that are into anime, so many of them will bring up how that was one of the shows that really cracked open their minds and said, "Oh, things can be things, and I have to think about this more than just mindlessly absorbing it." Um,
The idea that the movie is actually the series, but from Auntie's point of view.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I told these guys, and they want to interpret it. The ending specifically of the series of Revolutionary Girl Utena, that they want it to be, well, Utena died, and clearly she doesn't exist anymore. And I say, no, it's Otri Academy is really, um, a place that people are burdened. They have to overcome their burdens to leave, and it's sort of a halfway house, and they have to once they've gotten past whatever they're limiting themselves with, then they can leave the academy, and that plays out very viscerally and symbolically, and in a crazy way in the movie. But in the series, you don't really get that explained in as flashy language. But
Hmm.
yeah, I'm right with you that I see that as the same exact theme as the show.
So, so what you're saying is a more subtle form of angel beats.
Angel Bee's a lot of things. It's not very subtle, is it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I get. Yeah. Pretty much. A lot
But
better.
yeah. But yeah.
So,
Otherwise, oh, go ahead.
so from your experiences with the Mikage, and then with the Mikage Club, and then following into working on your thesis, I'm curious to know sort of where did you start building your thoughts on the subject of applying uh, the goal of critical inquiry, thoughtful discourse, and cultural awareness. I believe that's a quote from your thesis, and sort of where have your thoughts gone from then to now?
Well, back then I had this idea that they're using this to teach and learn about Japanese culture because a lot of what we were looking at just in the department was culture and education, right? How is it that people from marginalized groups, how do they not benefit from traditionally from public education and the like? And so I thought to myself, a lot of people who may not feel as though they're doing any worthwhile cultural learning in public school, for many of them, Japanese animation is their first entry into kind of global education in a sense. And this in this way, kind of picking up native Japanese materials and learning something about that. So what I kind of noticed from a lot of my talking with fans, this sort of tendency of they felt as though, oh, I have to justify my taste in anime by what I'm learning about, say, Japanese culture and the like. Well, of course, culture is Japanese fantasy, right? It's basically this something that's coming from the context of Japan. If we can see of excuse me, Japan is sort of this context for the production and circulation of anime, right? But as far as it being a mirror of Japanese culture, in a lot of ways, it's really a mirror of, say, an individual director or a studio, or it might actually say more about a region of Japan, less so than, say, sort of a country as a whole, or it might say something about global flows of film and novels and whatnot, and how they've been received in Japan, but not necessarily a mirror. But in a lot of cases, when I've talked to fans, they were more interested in, not so much talking about what they knew about Japanese culture or anything else they may have learned from anime, although that was important. But many of them also were trying to establish a sense of connoisseurship. That is, because I'm able to critically analyze anime, I'm not those gross fanboys and fangirls. I'm not the Fujoshi. I'm not the weeaboo. I'm not, basically, I'm sort of somebody who can kind of rise all above that. So what I found critically, what was happening in anime fandom wasn't just, this valuing of learning, although that certainly was part of it, but it was sort of this hierarchy that many fans were sort of building amongst themselves, and more or less trying to show that they had some sort of emotional distance between themselves and the work, which, eventually I kind of toyed with this idea that, can people, or is it really necessary to have this kind of emotional distance and cognitive distance? You're basically putting emotion and cognition separate from each other. Is there, sort of a relationship between the two that fans are oftentimes slow to acknowledge? And some of that I kind of wondered, is it because they're talking with this graduate student, later professor, and they feel as though they had to justify their taste in some way? So I'm always wondering, how biased are a lot of the responses I'm getting, because they're afraid about how they're presenting themselves to me. And of course, for the most part, I'd say it's, that's one thing about methodology. It's a lot easier to go and in some ways interview somebody who you've known for a while. You've hung out with them in their anime clubs and the like. They get to know you. They realize, hey, this isn't someone I need to impress. And so in some ways, I feel as though I get richer in depth kind of responses. But of course, that has to be complemented by people who, I just sort of met and interview. And so for a lot of them, I feel as though they feel the need to kind of, put on this kind of error. And, I understand the sort of part of it, but it's just, something I have to control for. And you think, okay, they're saying this, but what are some other possibilities of reading what they're saying to me? But of course, you have to be careful with that. You don't want to read things into the data that aren't necessarily there. So,
That that strikes me as really interesting, and coming from the wider fan base at large, and knowing what types of anime become popular on things like Reddit every season, um, you always get those kind of least common denominator, the shonen action shows and the you know etchy comedies, things that
mhm.
are uh, really unrepentant in how they're consumed. And I find it odd that your experience primarily has been people trying to, I don't know, uh, disregard that side of basic consumption. Fun things are fun, right? And I don't know why anyone would try and hide that when so many anime fans kind of, from what we encounter, wear it on their sleeves.
Yeah, it might be a dynamic of the internet because practically every interview that I've done has been sort of face to face, which I think affects a lot of how presentation happens. I would love to be able to follow a lot of these people who I interviewed and see how they behave online. I never get that side of things,
Yeah.
and sort of use it as a way of kind of comparing that. But yeah, it's something I have to continue. Like whenever I'm doing kind of research, that's why I'm very careful about my methodology, because someone like you, for instance, they say, well, wait, well, my experience has been very different with these fans. As you said, they wear this on their sleeve. And a lot of it is just the way in which the data sort of comes across. But yeah, I also, but yeah, as far as forums are concerned, I'm actually on Anime News Network pretty regularly there. And, that's another place that I've sort of found a lot of friends
Hmm.
online. Some of whom I've actually met. In fact, I'm going to Otakon next month,
Oh,
and I'll be
right.
rooming with a couple of them.
Oh,
So
crazy!
yeah.
We're going as well. Yeah, I'm giving a presentation on Sailor Moon.
Sailor Moon. Yeah, I'm actually me and Mikhail Kulikov. We're doing the panel on Russians and anime.
Oh, cool. We'll have to go. We'll schedule that. Temp, take a note.
Oh,
Will
likewise. I
do.
love Sailor Moon. So
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be great to meet you in person. That's
yeah.
wonderful. Man, so hmm, I suppose where we want to go on this discussion, let's save that for later. Um, right, so we wanted to talk a little bit about the intersection of anime and education, and something you've been looking at. Now, Temp, I know, went through kind of with a finer toothed comb than I did over your dissertation. Do you think that is still something um, that we can talk about today? Or do you look
Absolutely.
back on that and kind of cringe?
Oh no! In fact, I look back on what I've done, and I look at it as sort of a springboard for a lot of unanswered questions that I'm still trying to answer right now.
Oh, great, great.
Um,
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
cool.
Well, I mean, on the one hand, my dissertation sort of, I think the one of the main conclusions I kind of got from my dissertation is that on the one hand, fans were very much expressed enthusiasm when they did about anime as, oh, North American media is not like this, right? Anime isn't episodic. You have it's a very rich and in-depth kind of story that you have to get into. Whereas North American media is superficial, it's shallow, it doesn't really speak to me on any sort of level, right?
Hmm.
So, and not only that, but they also cite about how, oh, you can do anything with anime. You can have these sexual situations. You can explore this sort of level of violence that entities like 4Kids are completely going to censor when it comes to the American airwaves and the like. But what I noticed when I was looking at the clubs was when something uncomfortable to them, either sexually or in violence, kind of came across the screen. And started talking with them afterward. They were like, "Yeah, Japanese culture really allows for perversion, and also, like, violence against subordinates is more accepted, and I don't think that's cool." So it was sort of like they were trying to kind of hold themselves above, so that on the one hand, they could use anime to sort of critique deficiencies they saw in North American media, but on the other hand, they said, "Oh, well, if there's something objectionable I find about anime, we can just sort of blame this on quote unquote Japanese culture."
Okay,
So,
so did you
so
take
yeah,
it as hypocrisy then, or did you see it as these people kind of understanding that this media was made in a culture different than theirs, and that the values inherent in it aren't intrinsically theirs, and sort of like a learning more about the world kind of view?
I think hypocrisy is kind of a loaded term in this case. I don't think, hypocrisy, I think, implies a bit of intent, which I'm not sure I can actually read that here. But I think is that, it's this sort of way in which, I would say trying to have a sense of self efficacy definitely plays into that. The sense that, there are these things that I critique. There's this, I can use anime as a tool, not just of something I can enjoy, but something I can use to critique. But at the same time, I think when they encounter something they find disturbing in anime, a lot of cases, they need some kind of repertoire. They need some sort of answer to why it is that they feel, so uncomfortable about this, about what's the main encounter in anime. And, our culture, I think, gives sort of a ready tool is that the other, in this case, if you want to call it the quote unquote the Orient,
Hmm.
or if you want to call it, just, the Asians or whatever, then it's like, okay, our culture basically says these are people who our culture, their culture is different from ours, and in some ways, they don't follow our morality. And so we'll just go ahead and, kind of use that as an explanation for why something squicked us out, rather than, kind of thinking about, our individual relationship to this media and what it might say about our own culture and the like.
Oh,
Um,
I see. Okay, so the
rarely is anyone going. I mean, people usually, everyday people usually aren't going to be that introspective, and that's okay.
right. They stop short of the self-reflection. Okay.
It's just it's not something where, I mean, most people just aren't really given to it. That's fine. But it's just sort of a dynamic that I've kind of seen there. So in a lot of ways, I'd say my dissertation was, one point was, they're not just learning about, say, tidbits of Japanese culture, or maybe the animation process, or maybe how symbolism may work in something like Utena,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
they're learning a particular form of connoisseurship that helps bolster their self-efficacy, both as individual fans as well as fandom as a collective. So, since then, I have actually taken my research into a few other directions, because I thought to myself, okay, I kind of wrote this dissertation with this idea. Okay, this is something that maybe teachers could sort of learn from, but I didn't want to just kind of leave that up in the air. I was really interested in,
Hmm.
okay, how might teachers actually look at this research or look at this idea of, anime as education. So, in a subsequent study, and actually my paper for this, or my first paper for this, will be coming out in Macadamia Second Arc, um, in the next issue. But from there, I had interviewed some aspiring teachers, people who had no exposure to Japanese animation whatsoever, and basically what happened was, well, okay, first I interviewed fans again, not the same fans I did in my dissertation, but different fans. And I was asking them similar questions to what I asked in my dissertation was, okay, what are some anime you like? Tell me about some instances where you felt something about this anime. And so they would, give me a long laundry list of anime that they liked, and some of them explained it more than others. And so I compile this list of anime that my fans like, and I go to my aspiring teachers and I say to them, okay, I want you to go through this list and I want you to watch something from here. Once you've done that, I'm going to interview you about how you felt about that and how you're making sense of this. Then I want you to go ahead and write up a lesson plan about how you would incorporate this anime into a classroom setting.
Oh,
So
wow.
I even got a lesson plan from Angel Beats, definitely Miyazaki movies. A lot of my aspiring teachers sort of gravitated to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're writing up all these lesson plans, and then I went ahead and did a kind of debriefing interview with them, and I was comparing what they had done with a lot of my fans, because not only was I talking with them about, okay, tell me how you feel about these anime, but I was asking them questions like, if you were a teacher, hypothetically speaking, how might you use this anime in a classroom setting? And so, they would
Hmm.
hypothesize a little bit and think, okay, if I were a teacher, this is what I do. So I was basically comparing the fans' answers to that question with how the teachers were answering that in their lesson plans. Found some fairly interesting data. And surprisingly, there was a lot more similarity than I was expecting, because I thought, for the most part, these fans, my hypothesis was, okay, these aspiring teachers, they know nothing about anime. They're not going to be part of a scene that, is going to prize, say, other facets of what we might call geekdom, right? Whether it's, say, other fantasy novels, whether it's video games. My aspiring teachers, for the most part, they're also not really going to be gamers. They're probably not going to be much into comics. They're probably not going to be um, so much into science fiction or other aspects of fantasy and the like. So I was sort of expecting, okay, there's going to be a lot of difference, but there was actually a bit more similarity than I was thinking. Um, Particularly in form. Both my anime fans and my aspiring teachers, they thought of anime more as a tool for eliciting student interest. Oh, well, if this student doesn't happen to be interested in something to do with literature or something to do with math or something to do with science, we can use anime as a springboard. It's
Mm,
not
yeah.
studying anime in its own right. It's, let's use anime to listen to student interest in order to produce this kind of cognition or to produce this kind of behavior. In other words, using it more as a tool, more as a means of an end rather than an end in and of itself. So, which, I thought, okay, well, maybe the fans will be a little more interested in kind of exploring anime in its own right. And not really. In fact, a lot of cases, if fans thought of themselves as being teachers, they thought, oh, well, we'll use anime to teach about bravery or friendship or persistence. In other words, these are sort of moral lessons that could kind of be gleaned from that, but nothing about, say, aesthetics, for instance, which that's a lot of what I'm interested in, is this kind of relationship. What I was referencing earlier, the relationship between cognition and emotion, which in the sort of process that a earlier there was one of the more famous philosophers of education, John Dewey, had described this process of aesthetics and how that could actually be used in education. This relationship between emotion and cognition, or what he might call cognitive refinement, to use his language. I found that very fascinating. But the only things I thought really sort of got close to this vision of aesthetic education were either people who were already in industry or people who who wanted to go into industry. So so I'm kind of like playing around with this idea after I exhaust all my data and write all the papers I want to. Is maybe my next project could be interviewing people in industry and how they feel about education. That is, what sort of educational experiences have sort of helped them either aesthetically or professionally, appreciate anime, or how is it they've used education previously to assist them in their jobs, whether it's in creating art, whether it's distributing art, marketing art, or any kind of aspect in their career.
Hmm. So, hmm. I definitely understand, and that's probably, if you would have asked me that question, yeah, that's probably the answer I would have given. Like, oh, look, Madoka asked a question about thermodynamics. Let's talk about thermodynamics a little bit and why this wouldn't work.
Yeah.
or yeah, something like that. And I so what's your it seems like what you're kind of getting at with your whole aesthetic thing was, and I completely don't know anything about this, so forgive me if I misinterpret it, but that it's not being used as art education or breaking it down for its components of, talking about visual media as an art form.
Yeah,
Or
generally, well, this I think it kind of goes back to the question that I think you and I get asked a lot is why do we like anime?
mm,
Um, and there's definitely different answers for that. More commonly, it's I like the story, for instance,
mhm,
or I like the fact that there are these long kind of narrative arcs and the like. But if you look at, say, other scholars of anime, for instance, Thomas Lamare, he has this idea of the animatic interval, which is this idea that it's actually the depth between the different kinds of images as they're layered on one another that
mm.
actually gives anime its appeal. Or you might go to, say, Mark Steinberg and his idea of dynamic immobility, which is sort of this idea that no, it is the relationship to the immobile character to these other sorts of mobile kinds of images around the character that actually give anime its salience. And but you could also say Ian Condry, for instance, when he writes about the soul of anime, his argument is that the soul, if one exists of anime, is a sort of circulation of anime between producers and consumers.
Ah,
And I kind of wonder what if there's a corollary to Steinberg and Lamare. What if it's the and between characters and worlds? That is, his one of Condry's main arguments is when the fans say, I like anime because of the stories, he seems to think, no, they really like it because of the characters that are involved and the kind of dramatic premises that the characters are going to find themselves in. And, basically how the world that they find themselves in, and of course, the worlds that a lot of characters find
right.
themselves in are very rule governed and the like. And so I thought to myself, what if the and between characters and worlds, that is this sort of, inexplicable, ineffable, but still salient component of anime that connects the character to the world could actually be part of what gives anime its salience. So the
Mm.
idea is whether you believe Steinberg or Condry or Lamare in their sort of idea about what makes anime appealing is once someone has kind of an emotional reaction to that and sort of wonders about, okay, what was the intent of the director or the artist or the studio and whatnot, and how does that intent relate, and how is it that they're located within these kinds of cultural networks, economic networks that basically kind of explains why they made what they made and what's my relationship to it.
Right,
What's
right,
my position within my own culture? What's my position with my own personal history of having watched not just anime but other forms of media or reading other forms of literature? And when you sort of get this, when you kind of reflect on your own personal media history and how your place in your culture has affected that history and how that interacts with the history of whatever it is you happen to have watched, and how it's situated within these different production and cultural kind of networks, is once you kind of got a sense of that, then it's a way of trying to answer back
yeah,
to that origin of what makes anime what it is, perhaps by creating your own work. Say fan works would be sort of a perennial example of a fan's attempts to kind of take that realization of who they are and what the anime is and how they can speak back to either that animatic interval or that dynamic inability or that characters and worlds that originally made anime salient.
right, right. And I think that's the interesting part as well. Absolutely. But I'm not surprised that you got the responses you did, and you didn't quite see a lot of people that were going in that direction, because I think a lot of even teachers are shackled to kind of a more in primary schools at least, maybe are shackled to subject matter that doesn't really allow for that type of free form thinking, and students haven't really experienced that too much. So I'm just thinking of the poor, high school science teacher that is trying to incorporate something like that, but just has to tell you about moles and chemical reactions and things, and there's not really any room in how they teach and how they understand teaching to bring in things like that. And yeah, like in a literary criticism course or something like that, like absolutely, yeah, we could talk about how these characters interact with the plot and or how their decisions are what's really appealing. And I love that. Yeah, I'd talk all day about that. But a lot of
Yeah.
people don't understand that that's education too. Or
I have a
Well, a
question.
lot of it, I
So
mean, this definitely isn't to like beat up on individual fans or even teachers for that matter. I mean, I like to think a lot of the issues I'm raising are more systemic. We don't really, I mean, it's just as you said, we have these sort of poor teachers who, aren't really doing this sort of thing because we don't really have a system to kind of encourage this kind of
yeah.
mode of
Oh, I
inquiry.
agree. Yeah.
So
Yeah, definitely.
now
These are
that I've kind of explored, go ahead.
they're just skills that people don't have or don't think are valuable, or that our system doesn't acknowledge as valuable. So yeah, I'm sure you teach college courses. You tell me. Like,
Oh gosh, I could be here a lot to talk about many comics here, but I don't want to be a dead horse.
did,
No, in,
did
in
you
this case,
excuse me, did you find any cases within the fandom where people were able to move away from, I think you'd mentioned self-efficacy and more towards finding an understanding of their own sense of aesthetics and sort of the topics you were talking about earlier?
go ahead. I think there were kind of references to it. Maybe again, it was people who I think were already invested in some kind of creative enterprise. They themselves were already artists, or they themselves were, they were thinking about okay, they were thinking about themselves as being producers, and I think that's a lot of key. And I think that's key to being able to speak back to what you might call the inclusive qualitative whole of anime is okay, how do I speak back to this through my own work or through my own interpretation of this work. So, and it isn't just artists, but it might be critics or, sort of investing yourself in this process of criticism as well. So, I would say, as far as the fans are concerned, um, it came up a bit, or at least, sort of hints at sort of getting to this kind of vision of aesthetics. And my thinking is, um, we could have an education system that asks more for reflection. I mean, our education system is very much defined by very apparent behaviors, right? Whenever a teacher makes up a lesson plan, they have to have objectives for every plan. And the objectives, it can't be the student will understand X or the student will be able to reflect about X. No, the student has to demonstrate a verifiable, observable behavior
right.
in order for the lesson plan to actually work. So, and of course, teachers, being overburdened as they are, in most cases, they're going to probably look for what we might call the lower end of Bloom's taxonomy. If you look at Bloom's taxonomy, it goes basically through several different levels of cognitive behaviors. The lowest level being knowledge, and the highest level being evaluation, and in the middle is where you get analysis and synthesis and the like. So, and let's face it, it's much easier to observe knowledge kind of behaviors such as tell or memorize. Students will be able to tell X. Students will be able to memorize X, right? Or students will be able to report on X. Whereas students will be able to evaluate, students will be able to judge, students will be able to critique, students will be able to reflect on X. That's a bit harder, but still, it's still something that can be verified, but it might not necessarily be something that a student can sort of pop down on a standardized test, which of course is still, even though we have every student succeeds today, which is sort of the replacement for No Child Left Behind, there's still very much these kinds of to produce certain knowledges and behaviors. And interestingly enough, people thought that with the new Trump administration and with Betsy DeVos, a lot of their rhetoric was, "Oh, we need to get the federal government off the backs of states. We need the states to sort of, if not do their own thing, then have a lot more latitude to meet these new requirements under every student succeeds." And the interesting thing is, under DeVos's tenure, they've actually been a bit more demanding on states to have certain kinds of standards to have these very much more verifiable kind of objectives that states have to meet. So, what kind of avenues that the Trump administration might be going through as far as education policy? I don't know. In some ways, it may still be kind of an open question. But as far as like, they're going to take this very hands off, laissez faire kind of approach to the states, we might not actually see that as much as we may have thought we were. What does that mean necessarily for aesthetics? Uh, I'm really not sure, but I think a lot of cases, if an individual district or if even a state wanted to pursue an education for aesthetics, I think there's probably enough room within the way in which certain standards like Common Core, for instance, are written, that a state could actually accomplish this, but it would still be pressing against a lot of the grain what schools have traditionally done, which is to produce desired knowledges and behaviors, rather than giving students tools to be able to collaboratively work together and collaboratively reflect in order to accomplish a more democratic society.
So, yeah, and again, I acknowledge the concern. I'm with you 100%. What I want to ask is, you as college professor, when you see this or the result of that, how do you go about exposing people to that type of education that they were denied maybe in primary school? And how do you, it sounds kind of cliche, but how do you crack somebody's mind open and get them thinking?
Oh gosh. In my case, it's probably doing. I think feedback is fairly important in that respect, but I think a lot of it is also trying to explore these kinds of gaps between what a student may be expecting out of a lesson versus what they're actually getting. That's actually why one of the works, one of the people, the theorist that I'm studying right now, Pierre Bourdieu, he was a sociologist, and he also was a sociologist of education. And one of the ideas, it wasn't really new, but it's sort of one of the main sociological expressions of this idea. It really began with Piaget. Was this idea that people don't really learn, or they do learn, but they learn most effectively when they come across a situation that sort of violates their previous assumptions about something, and they have to come to terms with what is it that they actually have to accomplish. So in my case, I actually like, a lot of cases, like if you look at a student's previous schooling in high school, they weren't asked to solve any problems for the most part. It was basically, okay, make sure you know this periodic table, or make sure you're able to do these physics equations, or make sure that you're able to kind of put together these quadratic equations and the like. But this idea that this is knowledge you can use to solve a problem was something that schools don't typically do. So I realized, okay, I had to have students to say solve certain problems in their community, or in this case, since they're teachers, I don't want them to just be teachers. I want people, and it's great if teachers are great in classroom management. It's great if teachers are able to break down simple problems and simplify them for students so they're able to accomplish that. And I mean, all good teachers are going to do those things. But my vision of teaching is to look at teachers and think about, okay, if you could assume the abilities of a principal, or if you could assume the responsibilities of even people in government as a teacher to really seize the reins and have this more democratic vision of education take shape, you're gonna have to know how to solve problems. And so, but I realize since students haven't been asked to do that, what I sometimes have my students do is this process called the thinking hats. And so the idea behind the thinking hats is, you see, traditionally in problem solving, when I think, okay, you're going to have to solve this problem, people normally think, oh, this means that there's going to be a side A which advocates this solution, and there's going to be a side B which advocates this solution. And so side A and side B, or in politics, Democrats and Republicans, they're going to fight against each other, and whoever happens to come up with the best argument, whoever decides that, is going to be the one to kind of put into practice what this solution is going to be. So I thought, okay, this isn't, let's get a different kind of sense about how problem solving happens. Instead, we'll use these thinking hats in which everybody, it isn't that everybody is going to come to a table and agree on something, is that you all are going to have to adopt the same kind of thinking at the same time. So under the six thinking hats model, you have the white hat, the red hat, the yellow hat, the black hat, the green hat, and the blue hat. And to sort of sum up, instead of say everyone say, okay, side A, you put forth your solution, side B, you put forth this solution. Instead, I say, okay, first, everybody has to be on the same page, put on the white hat, and only go through the information that is available to you. Not judgment, not solutions, but just information. What do we know about this situation? It could be, say, a problem with school funding. It could be a problem with way school is addressing special needs education. It could be a way in which school might be addressing poverty, something like that. And so the students have to first have just the strict information. Then what are some possible solutions which may be great, may be bad? It doesn't matter, but this is when you put on your green hat. And so everybody has to come up with solutions. And then eventually they have to put on a yellow hat because um, they have to figure out what's good about these solutions. And they have to put on a black hat, what's bad about these solutions. So, in this sense, it's called lateral thinking. It's when everybody is thinking in a similar process in which if they disagree about something, there's a hat for that that they can wear. But the important thing is for students to be able to consider other opportunities and other options, force them to sort of kind of think ways in which they wouldn't ordinarily think in order to produce a kind of solution that would be different than if they went through the traditional side A, side B kind of approach. So, in that sense, it's a sort of unexpected way of problem solving that helps open them up to new potentialities and new perspectives that they can use to sort of construct some kind of solution that they may not otherwise have done.
So, hmm, hmm. So, I just want to tie it back into anime. Do you think we offer different interpretations on our site, and we kind of get a lot of different views from different people that take things in different ways. And I can't help but when you're talking about the lateral thinking exercise, um, about how a lot of anime fans come through and come across as, um, that saying your waifu sucks, that anime's trash. Why do you watch that? Things along those lines of just falling into that combative A versus B mode. Like if I don't like this, it must be terrible, or and anybody who likes it must think it's great. And the filling in, we've had a lot of actual experiences filling in the nuance between the um, kind of two point of views, yes or no dichotomy, and fleshing that out. Maybe that's just my experience of engaging with people and connecting it, trying to connect it back to anime. But yeah, I'm bummed when people can't talk about the specifics or can't go based off the evidence and then move forward. Um, and you
Yeah,
see that a ton. I don't know. I see that a ton.
yeah. Well, I mean, you could sort of, well, let's go back to the your waifu sucks problem. Um, let's say you're all sitting around a table and you're all doing this sort of, you decide, okay, let's for fun do this thinking hat kind of exercise about why is this anime superior? Why does it actually suck? The idea is you don't just, if, people are allowed under lateral thinking to say something sucks, but without giving a reason. But there's a hat for that. There's the red hat, right? Red hats are about, putting your feelings out there without any kind of justification, without,
Mm,
it's just basically putting it as part of the map, right? But typically the red hat, you may want to introduce a hat like that earlier in a discussion when the topic is emotional, which anime sort of want to do,
gotcha.
so that once you've sort of laid out what you know about the show, and then you say, okay, this is my feelings about the show, then someone has to sort of posit an idea about, why it is, how is it that the show could actually be improved, or what's something about the characters that could possibly change, right? And of
Hmm.
course, someone can put out that idea, and then eventually they're thinking in their mind, "Oh, I hate this idea," whatever. But they still like eventually have to put on that yellow hat, and they still have to say, "Okay, this is why this idea, which I think is terrible, this is why I like this idea," but they have to give evidence for it under the yellow hat, right? Because
Right. Yeah.
our first inclination is to put on the black hat. It's to go and say, okay, this is why this sucks. I mean, the black hat, the Richard de Bono, who had written the book originally, he described the black hat as the hat of civilization, right? Civilization is conservative. Civilization is constantly obsessed with why things won't work. So it's kind of against our against our culture to kind of put on the yellow hat and talk about why somebody else's idea is the best idea ever. So in this sense, if we go and take it back to anime, then it may be okay. I'm trying to think of an example of a show that like let's see, what's the show? Nako. Let's see, Nako Kuro. It's Higurashi no Naku Kuroni. That's it. Actually, I don't like that show that much. But if someone's say talking about, okay, this is why this show should be explored potentially as a lesson, then yeah, I can go ahead and rail all day about it under the red hat. But once I put on that yellow hat, then I have to say, okay, well, there are certain kinds of perspectives about the characters that we don't really find out about until later. So this could be an example of foreshadowing, or ways
Right.
in which we build skills towards foreshadowing about what might happen. And I might be gritting my teeth while I'm saying that, but it's something I kind of have to say. And in that sense, yeah, it's going back to that gap between what I expected. That is, all right, here's an opportunity for me to shoot down Higurashi and try to say, okay, well, this is something I have to grudgingly say is supportive of Higurashi if I wanted to use it as part of a literature lesson. So yeah.
Man, have you ever used anime in the classroom in any type of classes you've given?
Oh yeah. In fact, I remember one time when I was collecting lesson plans, I wanted to give the students, sort of a model or example what to work with.
Mm.
So I actually used Hadoraku Malsama, or the devil is a part timer, as a model for kind of talking about immigration, because that's a lot of what the show is. It just happens to be there's two guys who are immigrating from a fantasy world into contemporary Tokyo. So in that sense, if we kind of compare it to other tales of immigration, particularly in the current era that we find ourselves in, there's definitely a lot of films for that. Then I think this is something that students could probably get a lot out of. So yeah, to answer your question,
Mm.
I've done that. I'm currently kind of thinking, okay, Your Name is such a mega hit in Japan. I mean, it's what, number 4 as far as like highest grossing films in Japan like ever. So obviously, it struck some kind of cultural note. And, it's sort of like, okay, obviously, we can't use the film to just say, oh, this is a window into Japanese culture. But we kind of see, okay, what are the dynamics um, between the characters? What are some of the themes that are sort of apparent in the film, to kind of get a sense at how it might be touching at not just, say, Japanese culture, but sort of modernity at large? Is this just another way? Is this sort of, if we're looking at Japan as sort of this context for modernity, then can we analyze this movie as sort of, one cultural context for sort of going through these notions of alienation between people, or the sort of lack of connection, which I think the film really hammers home.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and man, I would love to be asked that question. So I'm glad you're doing it. We're kind of winding down on the time here. Temp, did you want to get to anything specific?
Well, for that, I'd like to actually ask a question about what you just brought up. One of the lines from, I believe, in 2009, you wrote interviews with adolescent anime fans, and there was a line that struck a chord to me on the subject. I think it was something along the lines of deaths of fans understanding of Japanese cultural context in anime can vary from the trivial to the thoughtful to the misinformed. In our community, we often have a lot of trouble where it's very easy to build, I think you had mentioned something along the lines of stereotype understandings. And as a result, we have a lot of, we run into a lot of conflict where we're uncertain as to the degree of confidence that we can sort of approach the conclusions and ideas and the thoughts that we're having. From your experiences teaching and using anime in teaching, as well as your experiences interviewing people, interviewing people at conventions and in your classrooms and at the different clubs that you had attended, did you ever find any solutions for people to better rationalize or realize what to do with these kind of thoughts?
I kind of wonder if rationalization is sort of overblown in this case. I think, sort of writing from a kind of a different place, because when I wrote that original chapter, I kind of, was very much establishing myself as a scholar and was making very much this argument. Oh yeah, we can totally include anime in this comprehensive package of school reform and the like. And now I'm sort of like, is it okay to kind of, not rationalize everything that we think and feel about anime necessarily, or if it can be rationalized, maybe we're too quick to do so. I mean, going back to this aesthetic model, where I'm talking about, okay, we feel something about anime, and let's kind of look at the connections between the producers and ourselves, and how we go back to the emotion. Sometimes I've thought to myself, there are things that I feel about anime, I just sort of feel it, at least right now. And if I'm not rationalizing about it, this moment, that's fine. It's just like, say, it may be, the way a character is drawn. It may be the sort of fluttering of my heart I feel whenever I see two characters sort of engaging together. And, sometimes I wonder, okay, if I'm rationalizing why I feel this way, then is it because it's a sort of after the fact kind of rationalization I'm making? Or is it a conclusion that I kind of came across because there's really something there? So I think one problem we kind of have to, I think fans might want to explore, is kind of problem of phenomenology. And to kind of put it in a nutshell, it's, you have on the one hand this sort of sense, this relationship between yourself and the object, in this case, the anime that you're watching, and something being produced from it. In other words, this first sense of something, this first cognition of something. And then there's the sense you're making out of it, which can be very different from what kind of feeling you have from it. So, in a lot of ways, if you look at something like, say, symbolic interactionism, it's very much this kind of traditionalist sort of way in which we've thought about interaction, that people, use symbols like language in order to make sense about things. That's the thing about symbolic interactions, is it's all about the sense making, right? It's not about, it's very difficult to go to that initial phenomenon between yourself and the anime and what you felt. So I think fans would probably do themselves a great service if they think to themselves, how is it that I'm explaining what I feel about anime? Is it going back to the thing itself, that initial kind of interaction, or is it an after the fact justification? And if it is after the fact, what is it being influenced by in terms of my culture, and how that culture has allowed me to make sense of this first thing that I came across in interacting with this medium that made me feel something? It's
Oh,
very difficult. It's really difficult to kind of
mhm.
distinguish between what was the actual phenomenon and what's the sense you made about the phenomenon. Philosophers still argue about this. And, I think putting it on the page would, a lot of ways help our conversations, and probably help us think about ourselves as fans a little, or at least expand our definition of what a fan is and how a fan actually interacts with this stuff that we know and love.
Oh, I completely agree. Even in this community, we've actually brought up the topic of semiotics and Saussure's writing on sort of the symbols and coming to our own understandings, and similar to the subject of symbolic interactionism, and for example, the writings of, I believe it's George Mead or Med.
Yeah, me.
But my question here is, you brought up the subject of after the sort of after the fact thoughts on the subject, and from what I could tell, it seems like you kind of gave it in a negative connotation, and I don't mean that like in a bad way, but what would you say are some of the ways that somebody who's a fan could, like, I guess the question I'm trying to ask is, what are some of the ways that a fan could avoid or better recognize when that kind of thought is occurring, as opposed to really trying to get a better understanding of, I guess, what they're seeing and their own
Yeah,
senses?
yeah, it's sort of like can the brain kind of explain itself? But I'd say I wouldn't say it's not really negative in the sense that, the after the fact generalization or justification is a bad thing, and it's not. It has its place. But I think it's that, just sort of recognizing. But as far as your question, how do fans know whether or not it's an after the fact kind of recognition? I think if it can sort of speak back to what we might call the inclusive qualitative whole, because I think the inclusive qualitative whole, right? The stuff that made animation what it was in the first place, when fans can kind of think about their justifications in light of the inclusive qualitative whole, that can, if not get them to the things in and of themselves, the central issue of phenomenology, if you believe that's impossible, that you can't really, that it's inevitable, it's something you can't really talk about, that everything that you say is an after the fact justification, then perhaps some justifications are closer to the source than others. But yeah.
I I
Thank you.
think you're right there, and thanks so much, Dr. Allison, for providing us that perspective, because I loved hearing it, and I think that's something that a lot of not only anime fans but just Americans in general would be better off had they taken the time to think about. Um, do you have anything else you want to say? Anything you want to promote? And check out your panel at Otakon.
Yes, check out my panel. Come, it's we've got Russians in anime, and we actually are trying to get another panel, Introduction to Anime Studies. It's kind of on the wait list now, so that might actually come. So I'll be talking more about stuff that I've been talking about here, just in convenient PowerPoint form. So,
All
but
right, awesome.
but yeah, otherwise, yeah, it's like I'm usually on the con circuit. Obviously, I'm gonna be, I'm in Station Con, MomoCon.
Are you going to Dragon
Also,
Con?
Anime Week in Atlanta, I have panels there, so you can check me out there as well. Also, Anime Expo, yeah, that's if you're part of the 100,000 of my best friends who are coming to that, then obviously we'd love to have you there. But yeah, let's see. Otherwise, I still have to catch up on the new season. Now that I've gotten back, I'm still trying to like watch all the anime that I missed from like spring season. So yeah, I'm like way behind right now, and I'm trying to fix that.
All you have to watch is The Moon is Beautiful and Little Witch Academia.
Yes, I love both of those shows. I was watching them on the plane actually.
Right.
Yeah, Ski Ga Kyudai, that one it's very sweet, and I think I'm like 4 episodes in on that right now,
Oh,
and yeah, it's definitely got the feelings of WAF. Let's put it that way. And
we have to meet up in real life.
I'd like to chip in the Eccentric Family season 2 as well.
yes, Ucha Tenkazuku, yes, I love that. It's like, oh god, it's man, I want I just love the older vulnerable Tengu who's like he's sort of this crusty old guy who's like he just nothing's really gonna get to them, but throw Benton into the mix and he's just like a pile of putty. I love it.
Right. We're very big fans of Tomihiko, Marimi Tomihiko here, so it's definitely one of our favorite shows.
Yeah.
But
Well,
no, definitely we got to meet up. If you want to like send me an email later
we'll
and
do.
just kind of get an idea about what your panels are, then yeah,
Yep.
we'll
Absolutely.
totally
I'll
meet.
stay in touch. And Dr. Allison, once again, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. And, it was
Hey,
great
thanks
to
for
hear from
having
you.
me.
Yep. All right.